I remember absolutely nothing about being taken off the train. There was some sort of confused recollection of my father crouched at the back of an upper berth in our drawing room, his eyes bulging and his lips twisted back from his teeth. But I've always assumed that that was a nightmare brought on by the fact that I was so sick on the trip. I have not thought about those hours of sickness on that train for a long, long time. The illness had begun suddenly in the middle of the night and continued until morning. I was sleeping like the dead when the train finally pulled into the old Mopac station in San Antonio. My father carried me to a cab, and we went home. By the time I got there, I was feeling much better and was eager to see my friends. No sooner had I gone through the motions of helping with the luggage than I was off, my sickness forgotten. I remember it was then that I told a story which has remained in the back of my mind for years, of hearing a wolf howling and seeing one on the roadside. Even as I told the story, I remember being a little confused. Since then, it has lingered, the image of the wolf in the clearing and the sound of its voice echoing through the night. I knew even as I spoke that we hadn't really seen a wolf or heard one howl. Why then was I saying it? Where had it come from? Was it one of the screen memories which was so common to experiences with the visitors? My memory of the December the 26th incident was at first blocked by the recollection of the owl. My life is full of peculiar stories like the one about the wolf. Many of my screen memories concern animals, but not all. I remember being terrified as a little boy by an appearance of Mr. Peanut. And yet I know I never saw Mr. Peanut except on a Planters can. What is behind the screen memories? Perhaps on some level I do know. Maybe that's why I spent so much time peeking into closets and under beds. If I really face the truth about this behavior, I must admit that it has been going on for a long time, although in 1985 it became much more intense. Now that I have uncovered these memories, though, it has ended completely. What had my life really been? And how many other lives have been lived like mine, skidding the surface of this dark mirror? I wondered in early 1986 if a couple of recent strange events might have some relevance to this inquiry into the past. During the third week of March, a very peculiar thing happened to me. Sometime in the night of March the 21st at the cabin, I awoke and found myself unable to move, or even to open my eyes. I had the distinct impression that there was something in my left nostril, and that it was being slowly moved far up my nose. When I tried to struggle, I heard a pop, like an apple crunching between my eyes. The next thing I remembered, it was morning. I noticed during the day that my nose hurt. There was a little bleeding, but as my wife and son had reported similar injuries without the memory of something being in their noses the week before, I assumed that this was the result of a head cold and dry winter air. But I never came down with a cold. I thought no more about this until July the 26th, 1986, when I received a letter from Donald Klein in which he mentioned that many of my symptoms were consistent with an abnormality in the temporal lobe, and that the method of testing this involved a nasal probe. The temporal lobe is arguably the most important part of the brain, the seat of humanity itself. It is in the temporal lobe that sense is made out of perceptions. People with temporal lobe epilepsy report déjà vu, unexplained panic states, strong smells, and even a preoccupation with philosophical and cosmic concerns. They also sometimes report vivid hallucinatory journeys. Initially, I seized on this as a way to explain my whole experience. But the more I studied temporal lobe disorder, the less it seemed an answer. It did not explain the overwhelming sense of the real connected with my experiences. It did not explain the physical consequences. It did not explain the witnesses. Temporal lobe epilepsy was nothing more than another speculation, essentially no different and no more supportable than the visitor hypothesis or any of the other hypotheses that I had put forward. I decided that I would arrange 2 separate temporal lobe tests, one by a neurologist recommended by Dr. Klein and another through a different psychiatrist. This second neurologist carried out the same preliminary examination done by Dr. Klein's man and came to the same conclusion. There was no evidence of abnormality. I went to a lab, took chloral hydrate, and endured the insertion of electrodes deep into my nasal cavity. A few days later, the results came back. Absolutely normal temporal lobe function confirmed by both neurologists. There was one incident that is worth recounting because it was this incident more than any other that opened the door to the past. The night of Friday, February the 7th, we spent in our apartment in the city. I was absolutely frantic. I had an awful feeling. I felt their presence. It was palpable. Most upsetting, I could smell them. I could smell a distinct odor as if of smoldering cardboard, and it was familiar from the past. My wife could also smell this odor. It was one we had both smelled many times. There was also another odor, as if of cheese and cinnamon, that I remembered from December the 26th. I remained lying in bed, sweaty and sleepless. I was shocked to discover that 4 hours had passed without my noticing, very suddenly. I was reading at midnight, turned a page, and saw by the clock it was 4 a.m., and I was no longer wearing my pajamas. When I got up the next morning, I found 2 little triangles inscribed on my left forearm. I don't know what happened, and there was no way at all to explain the event in a conventional manner. The larger triangle was quite straight, delicately incised, in just the outer few skin layers, as if by the work of a skilled master surgeon. The other triangle, very tiny, was pointing at the larger one. On the morning of February the 8th, I stood looking down at those triangles with a shower pounding on my back. I also remembered the odors I had smelled the night before. Odor is an excellent trigger of memory, and the odor of smoldering seemed to unlock a lot of doors. I last smelled it in 1972 or 1973. My wife and I had gone down to San Antonio to see my family, and we were sleeping in my sister's old bedroom on the 2nd floor of the house. In the middle of the night, I suddenly awoke with the impression that I had just heard a loud noise. I decided to get a glass of water. As I left our bedroom, I noticed a strange smell, like smoldering cardboard. As I went toward the bathroom to get my water, a small, dark figure with a red light in its hand burst out of my old bedroom and dashed downstairs. I was momentarily astonished, but decided that it must have been a family member. The fact that this individual was much smaller than a human being did not bother me in the least, nor even give me pause. Why not? Maybe for the same reason that none of us remembered the events of the night of October the 4th. I searched on, deep into my past. At the age of 9, I had been sleeping out with a friend on a lovely Texas summer night when something woke us up in the wee hours, perhaps an owl killing a rat, the stopping of the crickets, or moonset. In any case, we found ourselves awake and deliciously alone in the dark. We went exploring the quiet slips of the night. The vacant lot behind our house was then an acre of tall sunflowers, taller than either of us boys. We were wandering through these stalks when we heard someone coming toward us. My friend turned and ran. I stood there, then turned and ran as well. When I reached our sleeping bags, I was astonished to find him already so completely asleep that I could not wake him up. How could he have gone from running in terror to being dead to the world like that? Why hadn't he gone running into the house? He and I also saw a huge object cross the sky one summer night, an event I have always remembered as particularly strange. I called him. After a lapse of 25 years, we talked for some time, and then I asked him about those 2 nights. I told him nothing specific about my other experiences, nor did I discuss visitors. Of the first memory, he said, "We were probably just scared by a dog." He had this to say about the second. "Oh, yes, I remember that thing. It was huge. It looked just like... It was strange looking. And there was a black car. Now, I remembered that, too. Immediately after the object passed overhead, an old black car showing no lights went racing down the road in the same direction that the object had gone. From the night at age 9 to the event in Austin in September 1967, there were few specific recollections except those that emerged under hypnosis, and none was clear. By 1967, I was attending the University of Texas. In the last week of August, I had just rented a new studio apartment and moved back to Austin from San Antonio for the semester when I had an experience I now understand to have been what is known as a missing time experience, lasting at least 24 hours. I had moved into the apartment the day before and was sitting on the couch about noon, eating a TV dinner, when I was confused to discover that the dinner seemed to have hopped from my lap onto the coffee table and gone cold. I remember getting up to reheat the food and noticing that it was already 2 p.m. I decided I had fallen asleep while eating. I put the TV dinner in the oven and turned on the timer to heat it for 15 minutes. Then I turned back to the oven to check the temperature setting. I was suddenly woozy, my mouth dry, and the sun was going down outside. The dinner was cold again, and I had, and have, no memory of how the intervening hours had passed. I got scared, deciding that I had been the victim of blackouts, and I tried to make a phone call for help. It was midnight by the oven clock when I put my hand on the phone. It was exactly as if 6 hours had somehow passed in less than a second. I then began trying to make my way out of the dark apartment. I was terrified. I shook with fear and was so thirsty I could barely stand it. The next thing I knew, I was in front of the sink. The water was running and running into a full glass. My watch said 4:15. I rushed out of the door of the apartment and found myself in the cool of a Texas pre-dawn. At this point, I remembered something of awesome beauty taking place in the sky, which I later told my friends must have been a display of the Perseid meteor shower, which was not active then, but had been early in August. I drove to an all-night restaurant and had a huge breakfast and at least 6 glasses of orange juice. Some weeks later, there was a frightening sequel. I was lying in bed at my grandmother's house in San Antonio reading Time magazine. I was suddenly transported back in time and back to Austin a few weeks earlier. I leaped into my car and backed out of the apartment house parking lot. It was night and the windows of the car were closed. I couldn't see out at all. In fact, I could see nothing but the reflection of the inside of the car. I was so blind that I was forced to stop. Something approached the car. I was frightened to see, peering in the window with its face pressed almost to the glass, what seemed almost to be a demon with a narrow face and dark, slanted eyes. It spoke to me in a high, squeaky voice, and I remember saying that we couldn't leave the car out in the middle of the street. Then I found myself in an agonizing struggle. I was at once in the car, fighting to keep driving away, but unable to overcome an urge to get out and go back into the apartment, while simultaneously fighting in the real world an overwhelming urge to get out of bed and rush outside. Then it ended. The magazine was still propped up on my lap. This terrible nightmare had obviously caused not a stir. I believe now that this was a nightmare memory of an attempt I made to escape whatever unearthly thing happened to me in my apartment in Austin. I was reliving an experience which at the time it happened was so unspeakably terrifying that I still don't recall the actual event, only the dream. Then began a pattern of running that has persisted in my life until the present. A few weeks later, I suddenly became obsessed with the notion of getting away from the University of Texas, out of the United States, of going wherever I could, as far away as possible. I obtained a loan to study film at the London School of Film Technique. By January 1968, I had saved enough money and left for London. My first few months in London were bliss. Then, in July, there was another incident. I was at a friend's flat in the King's Road, Chelsea. For years I have described it as a raid, from which I escaped by crossing the roofs. What I actually remember is a period of complete perceptual chaos, followed by the confusing sensation of looking down into the chimney pots of buildings. Then there was blackness. I woke up the next morning in my own place with no idea of how I got there. The next day, I decided to leave London for the continent. I couldn't stand England for another week, not another hour. I took the train to Italy, second class. On the train, I met a young woman, and we began to travel together. At this point, my memories become extremely odd. I recall that we went to Rome, but that we spent a few days in Florence on the way. For some reason, I left the young woman in Rome and dashed off on the train with no ticket, traveling almost at random. I ended up in Strasbourg, where I saw the cathedral, then suddenly rushed to the station and grabbed another train, a local, that crept across France, ending at Portbou on the Spanish border. There I took a Spanish train to Barcelona. I was broke, so I holed up in a back room in a hotel on the Ramblas. I can remember nights of terror, being afraid to put out the light, or wanting to keep the window and door locked. The rest of the memory is a jumbled mess. I am just not certain what happened, except that I lost weeks of time. I returned to London in an odd way, weeks later than I had planned, with no way to explain those weeks. If such incidents were a frequent occurrence in my life, I might suspect some sort of trance or fugue state. There are certainly many odd incidents, but they are too variable in their nature to suggest the symptomatic consistency of disease. In January of 1980, Anne and I took an apartment on the top floor of a high-rise on East 75th Street. All went well until September of that year. This episode began when I saw a strange light streak down the night sky. It moved faster than an airplane and left me with the feeling that it had something to do with me. I was deeply and inexplicably moved, and left with an obscure foreboding. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by our son's crying. He was desperate, almost wild with terror. I rushed into the living room, heading for his bedroom. I recall the impression of a small, dark figure dashing toward the sliding doors that led to our 33rd floor balcony. Then there was a terrific explosion, and the beads of glass burst out of the pantry. I kept running for my terrified baby, reaching his crib after what seemed an eternity. I cradled him in my arms while Anne rushed through the house, turning on lights. Then she took our son and I went to see what on earth had happened. A siphon of seltzer had exploded so violently that the glass was reduced to beads, to dust. There wasn't a trace of the water that had been inside. Anne cleaned up the mess while I calmed our son. Then we went back to bed. In November, we closed on a co-op and by January 1981 had moved again, this time to our present apartment in the village. A year passed in the village, quite pleasantly and uneventfully. Then came what we called the incident of the white thing. One night, Anne woke up screaming and reported that something had poked her in the stomach. She had seen it, too. It was translucent white and about 3 feet tall. She was greatly agitated. Naturally, we took this to be a nightmare. Nothing more was said about it. Certainly, nothing was said to our son. The next night, at about 10, I was sitting up and reading. Anne had just turned over to go to sleep. Suddenly, I was struck on the arm. As I turned, I saw a small, pale shape withdrawing into the hall. I jumped up and followed it, only to find the hall empty. It hadn't been our son. He was peacefully asleep in bed. A few nights later, our son suddenly began screaming the house down. I leaped out of bed and went to him. He was terribly frightened. He said that a little white thing had come up to his bed and poked me and poked me. Neither Anne nor our son showed any physical evidence of injury. Once we reviewed this apparent past material, Don Klein and I decided to go fishing in it. We decided to cover the night at my grandmother's house, the fall of 1980 in New York, and anything else that might be of interest. This time, we tried for a very, very deep trance. We went first to the incident at my grandmother's house in 1967. The images were startlingly real, almost as vivid as if I were there again 20 years ago. "Granny's in the other room," I began. "She's reading, too. I see her light is still on. The rest of the house is dark." I turn a page. There's an ad for a car. Just staring at the ad. God damn, something's buzzing around in here. I'm fighting it. All of a sudden, it puts something on my head like a railroad spike. A silver nail. And I turn into something else. I'm heavy and big. I get up out of bed. I feel totally different. I feel like I'm moving, like I'm walking through the house, like I'm a ghost in the house. No, I'm not. I'm still in bed. Oh, it's so peculiar. Because I never moved at all. I get up and get a glass of water. I'm scared to death. I don't know why this happened to me. Try and relax now. Relax, Dr. Klein said. We talked about another time where you thought you saw a meteorite? Yeah. How old are you now? I'm 36. Tell me what happened. I'm working very hard on my new book. I feel pretty good about it. And looking out over the city one night, the sun had just set and it was beautiful orange glow. You could see the streetlights everywhere. I loved that den I had then. It's so beautiful of you. When it's clear, I can see all the way up to Bear Mountain. And then I saw this meteor. It came down out of the sky. Very tiny, like a spark. And I felt awed. Like it was someone coming to see me. I told Anne about it. And I went to bed. I love her so much. You know, I can't believe I'm seeing this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I look up from my book and there are 6 figures standing at the end of the bed, looking right at both of us. She's turned over and she's asleep. I say, Anne, look at this. They're menacing looking. I don't understand where they even could have come from. They make no sound. I feel like I've just gotten some kind of weight on me. I want to get up. I'm thinking about my son. I do not know what's going on in here. They're just standing there. They don't say anything. They don't even look like they're alive. Now, am I seeing things? I close my eyes. I open my eyes. And it's changed. Now they're around both sides of the bed, about halfway up. Like when you stop looking at them, they start moving. Oh, I've lost my mind. I have lost my mind. This cannot be real. Anne! I shake Anne. I don't stop looking at them. They're wearing uniforms. Why in the world won't Anne wake up? It's like I'm in another world. Oh, this is really foul nightmare. Who's that standing out there? I get the feeling this place is full of people. Our boy says, "Oh," and he screams out loud, real loud. They pull all right down to the foot of the bed, and I get up and I'm running like hell, and he's screaming like hell, and that praying mantis is standing right in the middle of the living room. I run on into my boy, and he's put his arms out, and I never saw that little boy scream like that before. Anne! What the hell was that? I pick him up. She comes in. We're holding him. Both of us are holding him. He finally calms down. What happened, Anne? My God, something blew up in the kitchen. A bottle of seltzer blew up. I've still got my son. I walk out there. She's out there working on the glass, and I'm rocking him. We've got all the lights on. I'm rocking him. Don then brought me out of the trance. I was shocked by the unqualified reality of what I had seen. I could just not believe in that moment that the forms persisting in my mind were anything but real. And yet, they had to be something else. Surely they did. The morning after the hypnotic session, I awoke not only feeling as if I had been beaten up during the night, I was aware of something new in my mind. At first, the exact nature of this new manifestation was not clear to me. I was oppressed by it. There was an acute impression of being watched. Then I began to realize why I was being watched. There was a face staring directly at me, the grave, implacable, subtly humorous face I had come to recognize from hypnosis. A vivid image of here had emerged in my mind. It was so real I could almost touch it. I think that the image was somehow triggered by hypnosis. Maybe the intense state of concentration evoked it from my unconscious, or maybe I attracted the visitors' attention and they responded. I felt a strong sense of relationship. Looking at it was more like looking at a person behind soundproof glass than looking at a picture. As I watched, the image moved its nose, revealing that this was obviously a sensitive organ both of touch and smell. The mouth was not straight, but rather one of those rich and complex lines that come to a human mouth with the advance of years. Centered in this mouth was a remarkable expression, the outcome, it seemed to me, of implacable will, leavened by what I can only describe as mirth. There were no lips at all. The chin was strong, very pointed, and there was a general impression that the skin was stretched over a plated bone structure. By far the most arresting feature in this face was the eyes. They were far larger than our own eyes. In them, I once or twice glimpsed a suggestion of black iris and pupil, but it was no more than a suggestion, as if there were optic structures of some kind floating behind those wells of darkness. It was those eyes that I saw staring down at me on October the 4th, those eyes that gleamed so furiously in the faint night light. I remembered them from December 26th, too, and from the summer of 1957. While the image stayed with me, it remained exactly the same as it was when I first saw it. On March 13th, I made a complete physical description on tape. On March 23rd, I would repeat the description again, then compare the two tapes. There was no difference. Late on the night of March 14th, after I'd come back from the hypnosis session covering events in our apartment on East 75th Street, I sat down once again to think things through. The image was with me, of course. I wondered what would happen if I asked it to come to me. I sat there looking at it. It looked back at me. Nothing more happened. The thought flashed through my mind, almost unbidden, that anything I wrote about this experience would be far more intense if I was given some sort of confirmation. The image responded with a sharper stare. On Saturday morning, we went to the country. Our son had invited a friend, and we picked this child up on the way. She was one of his school friends, also 7, and the two of them were full of excitement about their weekend together. Before dinner, I took a walk along our quiet, private road. On the walk, I saw a hair-thin streak of light come straight down out of the sky. I thought, I'm disappointed in myself, or in them. Why such a dismal little manifestation? It was dark when the four of us sat down to the dinner table. We had been eating for only a few minutes when our son's guest suddenly shouted, "A little airplane covered with lights just flew through the front yard." There was real shock in this kid's face. The child looked at me, obviously distressed. My impulse was to hide under the table, but I pulled myself together and managed instead to speak in an offhand and reassuring manner. "There's an air base near here," I said. "The National Guard base is 30 miles away." But it was all I could think to say. We don't let these things bother us. Best to just forget about it. I got up and went outside, but saw nothing. Soon the shock subsided, and the children went on eating. After dinner, Anne and I went upstairs and discussed the matter. Frankly, the kid's observation, coming as it did at that moment, had convinced me that on some level what was happening must be real. Why else would the child have made that announcement? Not a word about the visitors had been said within earshot of either of the kids, and the little girl was absolutely without information on the subject. Maybe the child really saw an object in the physical world, but maybe, also, the mind has powers that we do not understand. Perhaps there is such a thing as mental telepathy, and when I asked the image to help me, what I really did was to send my own inner self on a quest. And at the end of its quest, it found this innocent, open little mind, entered it, and there created an hallucination, knowing full well that the little guest would be the last person at the house likely to see anything, and thus the first one to be believed. By 9, both children were fast asleep. I was in a surprisingly benign mood, listening to music on WAMC out of Albany and enjoying being with my wife. We sat together in the parlor in our big upstairs bedroom and got sleepier and sleepier. By the time the clock rang 10, it was all we could do to crawl into bed. We went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I was awakened abruptly by a jab on my shoulder. I came to full consciousness instantly. There were 3 small people standing beside the bed, their outlines clearly visible in the glow of the burglar alarm panel. They were wearing blue coveralls and standing absolutely still. They were familiar figures, not the fierce, huge-eyed, feminine being I have described before, but rather the more dwarf-like ones, stocky and solidly built with grey humanoid faces and glittering, deep-set eyes. They were the ones I felt were the good army when they took me on December 26th. I thought to myself, my God, I'm completely conscious and they're just standing there. I thought that I could turn on the light, perhaps even get out of bed. Then I tried to move my hand, thinking to flip the switch on my bedside lamp and see the time. I can only describe the sensation I felt when I tried to move as like pushing my arm through electrified tar. It took every ounce of attention I possessed to get any movement at all. I turned my head, fighting a pressure that felt as if a sheath of lead had been draped over me, and saw the light switch in the dark. I watched my hand move slowly closer, and finally felt the switch under my finger. I clicked it. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. The electricity was off. The burglar alarm was still working because it had battery backup, but apparently it meant little to them as they had entered the house without tripping it. When I turned my head back, I confronted a sight so weird I thought afterwards that I did not know how to write about it. Beside my bed, perhaps 2 feet from my face, close enough to see it plainly without my glasses, was a version of the thin ones, the type I have called her. It was not quite right, though. Its eyes were like big black buttons, round rather than slanted. It appeared to be wearing an inept cardboard imitation of a blue double-breasted suit, complete with a white triangle of handkerchief sticking out of the pocket. I was overcome at this point by terror so fierce and physical that it seemed more biological than physiological. What was I going to do, having called them? Lie here and quake? I had wanted to communicate. I wanted them to know I was still in possession of myself, that despite what I can only describe as a terrific assault against me, physically and mentally, I was still functional, and on some level, independent. Lying in that bed, I felt a very strong sense of responsibility. I had to communicate in some non-threatening manner. I was an emissary of sorts, although perhaps only to the court of nightmare. Again, it took an absolute concentration of will, a centering of my attention, and the application of the most careful effort to the muscles of my face, but I did manage to smile. Instantly. Everything changed. They dashed away with a whoosh, and I was plunged almost at once back into sleep. What happened the night of March 15th was fundamentally different and more open than any other contact I have had. The visitors almost irrefutably announced themselves to me. They allowed me to see them while in full possession of my other memories of them, albeit in a more or less completely restrained physical condition. And they preceded their appearance to me by the witness of the uninvolved child, the one person there that night who had absolutely no relationship to this at all. Who had come to see me during the night? Did they really drop down from the sky? Or have they come from some other cosmos, a place where dreams are real, and reality a dream, where shadows and those who cast them are one and the same? My impression is that these people, if they exist, are more than a little afraid of us. They are deeply afraid. I suppose it was best to smile rather than move my hands toward them, but I wish that there had been touch. Could there have been? Or would my fingers have crossed only air? I suppose that I will always wonder. I asked for confirmation, not proof. It seems that they took me at the exact meaning of the word. From the beginning, I had been disturbed that my wife and son might have been involved in this. At least, they had suffered with me through my upheavals. At the worst, they were as entangled as I am. Our son has been preserved from almost all conversation about it and from direct experience of my personal trauma. When Anne was first hypnotized to aid her in recalling the nights of October the 4th and December 26th, she was aware only that something very unusual seemed to have happened on those dates. I did not keep it all from her out of some desire to preserve her the purity of hypnotic recall. I kept it from her because there was a possibility, however remote, that visitors had been around us in the night. Thus, the visitor hypothesis had been discussed by us only in general terms. Only after her first hypnosis, which took place on March 13th, 1986, did I indicate that I felt there might have been some non-human presence involved in our lives. Before hypnosis, Anne had a vague memory of me warning her of fire on the night of October the 4th, of hearing an explosion and our son calling out to me. She had no memories at all of the night of December the 26th. On March the 13th, 1986, Anne was hypnotized by Dr. Robert Nyman. We chose a psychiatrist other than Don Klein so that there could be no possibility of his questions taking on some sort of unnoticed direction because of what he already knew. Anne and I are a very deep, total marriage. If something was really happening to me, then she had to know. She would have some involvement. If she had reported nothing, then to me it would have indicated that mine was an essentially psychological experience, perhaps shared in some unusual ways, but essentially psychological. Despite all the progress I had made in dealing with this experience, I must admit that Anne's hypnosis disturbed me all over again. Her hypnosis does not reveal a person trying to concoct a story, but rather one trying hard to avoid remembering something she had been told in the strongest terms to forget. She was compliant, all right, but not with the hypnotist. She complied, it appears, with something else that issued previous, stronger suggestions. My wife appears to have been made to believe that my mental health depends on her not remembering, on her providing me with a safe haven in ordinary reality when I need one. Let's go to the night of October the 4th, Dr. Nyman began, when Anne was under hypnosis. You and Whitley were there, and your son was there, and you had guests, Jacques and Annie. You've said good night to your guests, and your son is already asleep. You and Whitley went upstairs. Yeah, Anne said. Just give me, to the best of your recollection, what happened that night, concentrating as hard as you can. It wasn't a peaceful night, but I don't remember why. It seems like there was a lot going on. I remember Whitley thought the roof was on fire. I don't remember that. But I remember it was like a culmination of a lot of other activity. I don't. It seems like it was late and not dark, but I don't remember that, and it's not clear. I get the feeling that Whitley was up all night, and it was this thing and that thing, and finally it was the roof. It was something else other than the roof on fire. What's going through your mind now? Nothing. Nothing? Concentrate hard. I just see a light. I mean, it's not dark. It's just that I have my eyes closed and it's not dark. It's light. Whitley woke me up and he thought the roof was on fire. If the roof's on fire, you'd see the roof all lit up. He saw a light that I didn't see. Is it possible that you didn't open your eyes? Yeah. Yet you do make some references to a light that night. Oh, that feeling is gone now. But I don't remember it as a restful night. You know Bud Hopkins is here, of course, and you don't mind if he asks you some questions? End of side 3.